Hello and welcome to the Shared Practices podcast. This is Richard Lowe. I am doing a little solo intro outro today. George is very much in the first few weeks of practice ownership, and so I'm just doing this one alone. But I am excited to be back on the show. And today we have with us Wayne Oplinger. And Wayne, basically, I was super flattered to find this out that he's been a fan of the show. He is an industry expert. He works with Benco. And he helps all sorts of dentists with transitions, both new dentists who are looking for associateships, who are looking to buy a practice, but he also helps docs who are getting towards the end of their career and wanting to get out and sell their practice. I love in this episode, George and him actually take some different sides and kind of argue a little bit, but they end up pretty much on the same page. So I think you'll find it interesting, some of the different topics that we hit today. But this is one of our many pre-ownership flashbacks. That's what the POF stands for on these episodes, pre-ownership flashbacks. I have to remember it every time because I'm like, what's POF stand for again? But we're doing these updates with people that are relevant to people who are in pre-ownership situations. Before we start season 4, which is coming up, we're going to do a whole season on case acceptance. And I'm really excited for the guests that we have coming up in season 4. So we'll get a few more of these updates. We're going to get hopefully Cameron Stroyan and some other people who we've had on the show before, bring them back, see where they're at right now. But without going too much further, I will introduce you to George and Wayne Oplinger.
I have with me here today Wayne Oplinger, and Wayne he works for Benco, and I think he has a very interesting role with Benco, and he's a huge fan of the show, and so I like to have people who love the show on the podcast themselves, and so Wayne will send me emails that are relatively lengthy with his thoughts on a lot of different episodes, and I really appreciate that, and I've really enjoyed interacting with Wayne, so I'm excited to have him on today, and I think he's just a wealth of knowledge, and he's really gonna help you guys out. So Wayne, how are you doing today?
Very good. Thanks for having me, George.
And why don't you go ahead and tell the audience what you do?
Yes, it's a brand new position in the dental industry, and that's one thing I like about your podcast. You're having a lot of people on that I'll call, they haven't made the podcast circuit, but they are very good at what they do, and they're well known in the industry, but they don't get interviewed that much. So I appreciate Shared Practices for bringing a lot of new content, and I believe my position will do that as well. So that's why I appreciate you having me on. Benco and I did a brand new position we created. It's called Transitions Analyst, and it's a third of my time I'm helping buyers of practices, a third of my time I'm helping sellers of their practices, and a third of the time I'm helping young associates either build their first practice or find associate work. And my role is educational in nature. There's no fees or charges for my services. Everyone always asks me on the first call, of course, why would Benco then invest in this position? It's really to earn goodwill for Benco, and it's Benco's give back to the industry that has treated them so well. And Benco likes doing things differently. We're a family-owned company, and instead of coming out with a paid position like this, we feel my position could add a lot of value and build a lot of trust and help a lot of dentists out there. So that's the short version of what I do.
And so Wayne, you're kind of like this, friend, like Paul Goodman calls him, the dental friend, where you're a wealth of knowledge and you just help people out who are, I'm assuming most of these people are, because they're Benco customers themselves.
Yes. Actually, yes. 70% of the people that I'm helping have had some interaction with Benco, know about Benco, but I'm also 30% of the time talking to competitive accounts too as well. But, I'll call my position, it is a friend, but here, the best way I could describe it is, people ask me, well, Wayne, why don't you help me sell my practice? Wayne, why don't you help me locate a practice? Wayne, why don't you help me with this agreement? I know through educating myself and going to a lot of seminars, taking a lot of CE, being trained by a lot of our partners, Benco's allowed me to do a lot of training. But the best training that I've gotten, George, is I talk to 50 to 60 dentists a week for the past 3 years. So the numbers are that I'm up over 4,000 dentists that I've talked to, and 90% of everything that I relay, I like to let dentists know, is from their peers. So 10% of me is putting it into an organized fashion. But I'm I'm really here to talk about the major check boxes that should be done. And then when someone needs accounting help, or they need legal help, or they need to use a broker, or if they really want to do something on their own, my role is to give the pluses and the minuses of both sides, because there is no, one right way to do it. And that's another reason why I like your podcast, George, because, you have people on who, one podcast may give opinion that you should absolutely use, a professional company for this service. But then there's some people that have done it a different way on their own. And I guess the best example is, you feel very strongly about acquisitions. You just recently had on Jamie Amos, who believes very strongly in, startups. So it's great that you're giving, both point of views and their pluses and minuses and their successes on both ends. So I like that you're doing that. And that's kind of my role. And I'm glad that's why you're having me on.
Well, I think to that point, I've always been very straightforward about every bias that I've had, and I'll continue to do that as I develop more. And I think Richard, that philosophy that we have at Shared Practices, where we like to show all sides of the coin, is I think that comes from Richard, and that's something that we'll continue to do for a long time. So I appreciate you acknowledging that. And I wanted to ask you, Wayne, in terms of your relationship. So I think we'll talk for the majority about buyers, but
okay,
initially,
sure.
I want to talk about your relationship with sellers. So how do you typically, what's your typical conversation with a seller? How do you handle it? What kind of talk with our audience about that.
Yeah. When I first, good question, George. When I first took this role, the Benco employees thought as my position as, well, we'll contact Wayne when we have an older dentist who tells us he's ready to sell. That's what happened a lot the first year, but what it's evolved into, and I like it much better now over the past 2 years, is the Benco reps are identifying doctors who, have not told them that they're ready to sell, but they should be starting to plan the process. So I like to do a lot of proactive work with the Benco folks and work with the doctors who are, possibly 3 to 7 years out. And because I tell them if they're very flexible, there may be buyers out there that are a perfect match for them. But unless they start the process early enough, they may not find that great buyer. And as you know, George, there's great practices that don't stay on the market very long. But I don't know how you feel, but my take is that 80 to 90% of the practices do take about a year or 2 years to sell. And it takes the right amount of time to find the right buyer. So my goal lately with sellers is to, yes, I'll talk to sellers who call me up and say, Wayne, I'm ready to sell my practice. But I like talking to ones who are a couple of years out so that we can develop a good plan, figure out what type of situation they would most likely, transition into or out of the practice. And, because I always ask, what's your A choice, your B choice, your C choice? The longer that you plan it, the more likely that you'll get to your A choice is the way I like to deal with sellers. Hope that answered your question, George.
No, and I'm going to ask a follow-up, but first I want to kind of explain to our audience why I'm so interested in the seller right now. Most of you guys are buyers because, that's who listens. From a buyer's perspective, I think it's incredibly important to understand the seller. So you can see what's going through their mind, and then as a buyer, you can try to position whatever fits best in your life, knowing what's important to them. So that's why I'm asking Wayne about the seller. And I wanted to ask you, what are options A, B, and C? Can you run through a few examples of some specific things that you tell them?
Sure. They'll always ask me on the first call, well, what do you think my practice is worth? Is a question that I get. And so I tell them, well, the value is anywhere from 40% to 80%, of course, of your last average 3 years collections is just something that if you Google, everybody knows and talks about. But the actual value of the practice, as you know, goes into a lot deeper things about, how many active patients are there? How many, what's your hygiene? How good technologically is the office? What's your recall rate in hygiene? So once I go into all those other factors, if they are thinking, geez, Wayne, I got a lot of work to do, I try to advise them to prepare for the transition. So I like on the first call, it really opens their eyes to what the buyers are looking for. And so I like to educate them, George, on what buyers are looking for. And then I like to tell them, here's what your options are, and here's how much your practice will be aggressively sought after, if you meet these parameters. So the seller's mindset, when I first started, a lot of people told me that most of the sellers have unrealistic expectations. And, George, the truth is most sellers, I'm finding it's only 10 to 20% that don't really understand what their practice is worth, because everybody always says, well, everybody thinks it's worth, more than it actually is. I'm finding it most sellers are reasonable, actually. And most sellers, know that they can't get 100% of collections or 90% of collections. And the other good thing that I'm finding out is that most people, I don't have anything against the DSOs or the corporate world out there, but 80 to 90% of the sellers I'm talking to really, really would prefer to sell to a private individual and keep their practice private. They're looking at corporate, as a last alternative. When I say A, B, and C choice, I will tell you more than 90% of the time, the C choice of doing a transition is corporate. A and B is, A, of course, is they would like to stay on. They would like to stay on through the transition, and they'd like to stay on for 1 or 2 years, or, work 1 day a week. And the B choices, of course, they'll say, well, if a seller really wants to do their own thing, I'll respect that. And, I could work 1 month or 3 months and, and leave, or I could sell on Friday and leave on Monday if they would like. But the A choice of most sellers I talk to, George, is they would like to stay on through the transition because, again, most sellers care about their staff, they care about their patients, and they care about the community they served. And that's who I work well with. And luckily, that's the majority of the people that I am working with. And they don't want to sell to anybody. So I know that's a long answer, but I wanted to at least give you the A, B, and C choices there. Hope that answered your question too.
No, that was great. And I think, a couple things. So you talked about sellers with unrealistic expectations. I have this. So, I talk to a lot of buyers, and so I hear it from the buyer's perspective that they think the seller has unrealistic expectations. So you're probably right. I think we maybe overemphasize that point. But I feel like, on a side note, I think there's like this personality type, like it's almost like an avatar that I can think of. It's an older dentist who does a lot of CE. His practice does, probably $1 to $1.5 million solo doc with a lot of technology. And I feel like every time I hear about one of those practices, the seller is a little bit more unrealistic than usual. Is that true? Is that something that would be accurate?
George, that's a good point you bring up. Yes, I'm dealing with a few this week where, the buyer is willing to pay $950,000 for a $1.2 million practice, and the seller wants 90% or 95%. So yes, but the sweet spot, George, if a dentist is doing between I'll say 650 and 850, even up to 900,000. Those are the ones who are very reasonable, and they're willing to sell for 70% or 75% of collections. And so it's good to know that that's the majority of them. But you're right. The higher technological, the higher the million you go, the more they're demanding, for sure.
Yeah, and I feel like also, from the seller's perspective, they've built up a very valuable asset, and so they may have a hard time seeing that go. But I wanted to ask you about the seller who wants to stay on a year or two. So yes. Do you think that's a true, when sellers contact a broker, do you think they still have that same desire, or do you think because you're talking to sellers 3 to 7 years before they're ready to leave that they're thinking that way?
No, here's the thing. Most brokers, even the ones I deal with very closely that are partners of Benco, they tell the doctor, hey, for you to stay on, for any amount of length of time, it's a little unrealistic. They actually prefer, because they feel there's more buyers who, are going to have to support the debt and pay for the loan, and it's, they feel, the brokers feel most dentists who want to stay on don't realize the cash flow constraints of the practice. And so my answer to that, and I wanted to tell most buyers, you've had certainly dentists who have been told on this show that, it's not a 2-doctor practice. But with flexibility and scheduling and changing scheduling, a $750,000 practice could be a 2-doctor practice if there's not much overlap and it has a good patient base. And, there's a lot of factors, of course, George, that go into it. But I know what you're saying about brokers or most dentists being 3 to 5 years out there thinking they want to stay on. I mean, most, yes, I guess if they would like to, if they say to me they'd like to work another 3 to 5 years, but they say, you know what, Wayne, if the right buyer comes along, I'll sell in a year or two. Yes, those, of course, are the ones who do want to stay on an extended amount of time. But even the ones who want to sell in a year or two, they do want to stay on 6 months to a year just to have a smooth transition, because what I feel them saying is they care about their patients, they care about their staff, and they feel like if they stay on, it's gonna send a good message. It's gonna thank him or her is gonna thank the patients they've served, and I guess I like that attitude that they just don't want to take the money and run.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize something you said, because it was subtle, and to me
Okay.
it really changed how I viewed things in my whole plans. So
Okay.
you said that if a seller says if the right buyer comes along, then they'll sell a little bit sooner. And I
Correct.
want that to resonate with our audience a little bit, because I think it's something that doesn't come natural to you thinking that way as a buyer. But I talked to a few older dentists, just asking them for general advice, early in dental school, and a few of them said that. And so I use that information as a way to put myself in front of older doctors and hope that, I can convince somebody that I'm the right buyer, so then they'll sell on my timeline more than theirs. And I think that importance to them of finding the right buyer is something that, as a buyer, you can try to use to your advantage, maybe, to find a good opportunity and make sure that you're the one that gets it.
Absolutely. Because how many times do we hear about buyers that get outbid, or they lose a practice because they didn't bid enough, and you know what, I would tell your buyers out there that are listening that just means that wasn't the right practice for them, because if it is the right practice for them, the buyer is going to appreciate who they are and what they're bringing to their practice. And George, I want to compliment you on one thing that I always want to tell buyers to be flexible, and buyers will give me a destination, a city they'd like to go to, and of course I ask them too, what's your A, B, and C choice, and I ask them to be as flexible as possible. But if you're determined and you want to work in a certain marketplace, and you're willing to put in the time and effort similar to what you did, you could work anywhere you want in the country, no matter. You could work in San Diego if you want. You could work in Phoenix like you have. So I do want to tell the buyers, if they're determined, it may not be an easy road to find that right practice in that right market, in that right geographic location. But, I will say the more flexible you are, there'll be a lot more opportunities, of course, that will present itself. But I don't know, do you agree with that, George? If you really want to work in Atlanta or New York or where it's considered an oversaturated market, do you believe that it takes a little more hard work to find the right place?
I think, I think I have to, right? I mean, that's exactly what I did.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I think that in general, whether it be pre-ownership or ownership, I believe in location flexibility and decision making, whether you're inflexible or flexible, but if you are going to go to a tougher area, I think your pre-ownership period will be more difficult and your ownership period will be a little bit more difficult. But I think it just has to be worth it for you to live where you want to live. And not everybody has that same, rigidity on where they want to live.
Correct. Okay.
So,
I just want to make sure we're on the same page.
Oh, no, we are. And, in your conversation, so kind of moving over to buyers now, in your conversations with buyers, how do they typically go?
Well, I usually ask them on the first call, again, please give me your A, B, and C choices. So I'll ask most buyers, and I'll take your input here, or if any of the buyers want to help me out, if I'm missing any key points. I like to ask, is your A choice of practice doing between 500,000 to 700,000, 4 to 5 operatories? It's already digital. It has a one full-time hygienist or 2 full-time hygiene. And I wanted to tell you, most buyers that I see, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for anywhere between 500,000 to $1 million, 4 to 5 operatories, or it could be 3 operatories, but room for growth. That's usually, if it's digital already, that's my number one spot that everybody's asking. So, but what I wanted to say on this show to the buyers is there's a lot of practices that are the B and C choice that you can make into your own practice. And a lot of buyers feel, that it might be an uphill battle to do that, or it might cost a lot of money. But if you take into account that what you're paying for the practice and then your overall investment, I just think too many times they discount practices that, are doing less than $500,000. Now, I certainly understand, and you've had enough people on the show that, it's hard to finance a $500,000 practice. It's hard for it to cash flow the right way. I'm hoping some buyers would be able to take a $400,000 practice that, again, is in a good area, has a good patient base, but there's a reason that the practice is only doing, 400 or 500,000. It may be because the doctor's choice is to only work 2.5 days, or I guess I don't like to use days. The doctor may be only working 15 to 20 hours a week. And that's all he or she chooses to work. So in those instances, if you just went up to a 4-day work week, you could turn a $400,000 practice, within 3 months into a $700,000 practice. Do you agree with that, George?
Not 100%. I mean,
okay.
For me, so I think we talked about two things. So I'm going to get back to the small practice in a second. But
okay.
I think first, so you talked about, and I think, I don't think one is right or wrong, but, when you talk to a buyer, you ask them what is their ideal acquisition. And for me, I ask them what is their ideal practice 3 years from the time they buy one. And I like to start there and then to go backwards to what an acquisition would look like. Because whatever their practice looks like, irregardless of the opportunities they're looking at, I think there are things that are easier to change and harder to change. So I like to look at it that way as opposed to looking at the acquisition itself. Does that make sense?
Yes, I like that, George. Yes.
But back to the smaller practice, I think, and in that episode you referenced with Jamie Amos, I think he made a great point where you have, larger practices have inherit systems that get built in to reach a certain size. And so somebody buying a $400,000 practice, one thing that they have to be mentally prepared for is going into a practice with very little organization and, creating that, almost like a startup, going into it. And not only do they have to have the demographic opportunity like a startup, but they also have to have the mentality of a startup of a lot of change to get to where they want to go, because I think the systems in that office are going to break if they try to get more volume. I think that's what's sticking out to me about that.
Okay, I love to debate you on this, George, because here's what I'll say now. But I think we're saying the same thing, but maybe we're thinking two different things. So I would like to see a small practice that's doing 400,000 to 500,000. I'd like to see the hygienist that was there, for 5 to 10 years. I'd like to see the front office person that was there 5 to 10 years. I'd like to see the assistant that was there, and for a long time too, who at one point, say 5 years ago, 7 years ago, that same practice was doing 700,000, 800,000. So if the practice and the people are built to be able to do it, but the doctor chooses not to do it. And again, so that takes some due diligence on the buyer's part to figure that out, because you're right. There are some small practices that are, they only had 2 ops or they had 3 ops, but they never had a full-time hygienist. They never got to, you and I probably see and analyze a bunch of small practices that never get over 500,000. And there's inherent systems in there that are not good as to why. But I guess I'd like to say, if you could find that small practice that was doing 700, 800, 900,000, but the doctor, again, someone probably advised him or her at one point, hey, don't slow down, because that's what I advise sellers too. Don't devalue your practice, but some choose to do so. Some choose to slow down. We both know they lose patience when that happens. It's not a mass exodus, but they do lose patience. But so that's the kind of small practice, I guess, George. Does that clarify it a little bit more for you on my standpoint?
Yeah, and I'm on board with that. I think everything that I talked about being an issue would not really be that big of an issue in that situation, because of the fact that you would have the you would have the capacity. The office has done it before, and you would just go back to doing it again.
Correct. Yep. That's what I was thinking.
Up next, a word from our sponsor, Q Optics. I love Q Optics loops to the point where I reached out to them and asked them if they wanted to sponsor season 1 of my podcast. The first time I put on their loops, I thought to myself, why can't everyone do this? Why can't everyone nail my angle of declination that I want? And the only reservation I had about Q Optics was that their magnification couldn't go high enough for what I wanted. Well, I am proud to announce that Q Optics now offers an expanded line of their prismatic loops. So you can go all the way from 2.5 to 3 to 3.5, 4, all the way up to 4.5 in their same frame that everyone loves. This is awesome because every other loops company that I've used in the past has always said, oh, well, yeah, we can do 4 or 4.5, but not in that frame. We have to go up to this other frame that isn't as ergonomic, and we can't push the angle of declination. And after 3 weeks of using it, my neck's hurting. I'm like, what's the point of using loops if my neck hurts? And I love more magnification. I love being able to see that big cartoon tooth at 4.5x and just know that my margin is money because I can feel and see it. Oh, and did I mention they're through the lens? This is no flip down, flip up, whatever you want to call it. These bad boys aren't going anywhere. If you are ready to upgrade both your magnification and your ergonomics, you can email sales@q-optics.com with the promo code SP16 for $100 off of the loops alone or $300 off a loop and light combo for our podcast listeners only. That's SP, as in shared practices 16, to sales@qoptics.com. It's time to have the best of both worlds.
So can you profile for us, the average buyer that contacts you? Probably somebody who's listening right now.
Yes, the average buyer who contacts me is someone who's been out of school, and I'll say this is the 80% or the typical average, is someone who's been out of school 4 to 7 years. They've associated for 2 or 3 practices, and now they're ready, they feel like they've had enough business knowledge, they've had enough good training, they feel like their productivity is up. That the one thing, George, that I'll debate you about too, and I want to get your thoughts on this, is because most buyers in that range, I feel like they are ready to own a practice. I feel like they've had enough, they've seen enough patients. They've worked at 3 or 4 practices, so they've seen systems. They've got the on-the-job training, and of course these are people who, I get very infrequent calls of buyers who are like, oh, I'm not sure if I want to own, or I'm thinking about owning in 3 years. Usually they contact me. I mean, the best buyers who I really love, George, are the ones who will Google Benco, Google transitions on our website. My name pops up, and without, they're proactive. They're calling on their own. I love talking to buyers like that because then I know they're ready. They've made it. They're not being told by someone to call me or call Benco and find out if there are any Benco offices for sale. They proactively do it on their own. So the one thing, George, that I wanted to talk to about this call, and I never heard this on any of your podcasts, and if I missed it or if you've touched on it, please excuse me, let me know which one it's on. But I love that you are taking ownership right out of school. I will just tell you my background, which I didn't get into. I was a small business owner, but I became a small business owner at age 29 after working in small business, in sales for 9 years. And even after 9 years and at age 29 owning my own small business, it took me 7 years and I made a lot of mistakes. And I will tell the buyers on this group, where did I make the largest mistake? I made the largest mistake in payroll, which of course after your loan is your next largest expense for a dentist. And I, George, in my first 7 years in business, I estimate that I wasted $700,000 because my business was typical profits and overhead and margins like a dental office. So my payroll was in excess of 35%, 40-some% for a few years, and it should have been at 25%. And the money that was wasted because I didn't have the business knowledge to know until I joined a peer group, until, there weren't podcasts back then. And so I wanted to say to you, I think you've done a lot of work to prepare yourself for ownership, and you're continuing to use coaching and use valuable resources, because without that, George, I think it would be so hard to make the practice to be as successful as it can. I hope that makes sense.
No, and I think you're asking me this at a very odd time, where I've just started, and so I think I have the kind of I'm going through what is obviously a very difficult time, in the beginning, and
Yep.
I think so. Two things I'll say. I see very clearly, and I think I saw through a really good friend of mine, Dr. Derek Williams, the benefit of being a dentist first and being comfortable being a dentist first and then becoming an owner.
Yep.
I think there's a lot of growth that happens early in your career, and I think it'd be nice, to not do that in ownership. I think that's a luxury that most people enjoy, and I, did not. So I think that's one thing. And so I saw his experience, and I think I saw the other side of it, where he had, I saw him go through it, and then I heard about him coming out of it and, being very happy he did it. And so, I decided to do that same thing. And it is obviously a more challenging road, emotionally, obviously. And, you're testing yourself in multiple areas at the same time, where you're expecting a lot of growth out of yourself. But then also, I think because of his situation, I put myself in a situation where I had a lot more support than he did. You mentioned the coach, but the practice that we're going to is very stable, and there's we're not having any change. The seller's staying on with us. There's a lot of things that we built in to make it more accommodating for us, but at the same time, it doesn't make it. It makes it easier, but it doesn't make it easy. I'll put it that way. So,
well, I think your chances for success are going to be greater. And what I want to emphasize is all the help that you seek out and that you try to educate yourself. And you can never have enough resources, I guess, when you are a small business owner to rely on. And so that's the point I was trying to make is that you're going about it in the right way. You're not just thinking I'm going to own a dental office and, it's going to be easy, I guess,
Oh, yeah, I totally misunderstood your point. No, yeah. And I think, again, I go back to Derek, watching him do that and as prepared as he was made me realize how much support I need. And, it's easy for, especially, somebody, who really, I really believe in myself. And I think it would be easy for me to, convince myself that I don't need a lot of support, but I really do. And so I think everybody out there should really get a lot of support. I think it's a big decision and there's a lot going on.
Well, you're going to find out, and you probably have already, that the days just, the day-to-day stuff just, gets you entrenched, and sometimes you got to find time to read and educate yourself and find those resources, because once you are the small business owner, you lose a lot of time because and it's that old saying, you get entrenched in working in the business and not on the business. So if there's anything that this podcast or you can relate to the people listening is your journey, if you could just make sure that they continue to work on the business as much as they work in the business, I think that'll be a big help.
Yeah, and I think that's something that, you start hearing all these same things over and over again. You read so many books and whatnot, and then, you realize that the reason why you hear that advice over and over again is because it's very applicable and, you really need that advice. So I think that's really, really great that you said that.
Thanks, George.
So,
you just have to live it now for me, okay?
Well, I look forward to it. And
okay.
So, Wayne, now going on to your third leg of the people that you deal with, the associate dentists and whatnot, what kind of things do you do there?
Yeah, George, there are some dentists, and that's another point that you and I had a little discussion in our emails about, there are some people that come on not only your podcast, but other podcasts and say, oh, you have to own. You cannot be an associate. Do you know how much money you're giving up if you're an associate? When I hear things like that, boy, I wish you had a caller line that I could call in and we were doing live, because there are a lot of great associate positions out there, George, that are, believe it or not, comparable to ownership. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that there's a lot of them or there's an overabundance of them, but there are some that are pretty darn close, and when you truly look at all the pluses and minuses and the time, the hours that you have to put in as an owner, I guess I just wanted to say, when someone tells you, Wayne, what do you think? Should I associate shift for a while? Should I own? I try to educate associates and say, well, if you don't feel confident in yourself, I try to coach younger associates who ask me, who are looking for positions. So I'm placing associates, but I'm also trying to help them with their career. Like you said, look, where do you want to be? I mean, that's one of the first things I ask them. Where do you want to be in 3 to 5 years? Do you still want to be an associate, or do you think you want to own? Because I'll try to place you with a dentist who is on your same time frame. Because, when I took this job, George, the one thing I wanted to make a change in, I don't know if you've heard this industry statistic that 90% of associateships fail, and what they're rating the failing on is that an associate does not stay in the practice for more than 2 years. They leave in less than 2 years. And a big part of that, I think everyone focuses on the search, but the other 2 parts of the process that are just as important that get left behind is the contractual and I'll call it the payment terms. And then the last part is the onboarding. How is the associate brought on, and how is the training with the staff, with the patients, and how do you work with the dentist owner? If those last 2 pieces were spent as much time as the search, we would not have a 90% failure rate. So I'm trying to make a change in that drastically, and trying to make a difference in that. So when I talk to associates, they will call up Benco and they will say, Wayne, can you help me find an associate position? So I go, okay, hold on. Yes, the search is very important, but let's talk about, have you been an associate before? So I just, too many times, I guess what I like hearing from the associates when they call and talk to me, the compliment to me is, wow, you took a lot of time asking me a lot more questions than anybody else did. And it seems you really care about, where I'm going to be placed. And I hear that from the dentist owners too, who call and say, Wayne, I'm looking for an associate. Most dentist owners will send me an initial email, like, they'll ask their Benco rep, does Benco help find associates? And, so the Benco reps will give my name, and most dentists will send over an email and they'll say, yeah, I want an associate with 2 to 3 years experience, and I need them to work this many hours. That's all they'll send me. And I'll say, okay, can we schedule a 30-minute conversation? And then they'll ask me, well, what do we need to talk about more than what I sent you in my email? And I said, well, I said, I'd like to know more about your practice, because, certain associates call me and they have their A choice, their B choice, and their C choice. And I want to find out what kind of practice you have, what type of work they're going to be doing. And, and then I'm going to let you know if you're an A choice, a B choice, or a C choice, and what you need to do if you want to be an A choice. So there's a lot more to it than just, I'd like to find an associate with 3 to 5 years experience. So hopefully there's lots more. As you could tell, I'm pretty passionate about it, George. I could talk about, but hopefully I'm answering your question there on how what's my part dealing with associates.
No, you're doing great. And from the perspective of the person looking to get an associate, what is an A practice, a B practice, and a C practice for an associate? Just for our audience out there who's looking.
So are you saying, would you like my opinion on the A practice as far as where the associate would be going to work? What's an A practice, a B practice? Is that what you're
correct
asking?
And you were talking about your conversation with whoever's looking for an associate. Yeah. I can let you know if your practice is A, B, or C.
Yep. Okay. So what I will do is, and this is great that associates who have been placed by me, when I follow up with them and ask them, what did they like about the practice? Why are they still there? I also, when I first took this job, George, the nice thing was a lot of Benco associates gave me the names of good associates that have been at practices, say, for more than 4 years, 5 years, 6 years. So I got to call them up and ask them, why are you still here at this practice? What made you stay? How did you find this practice? Was it through an ad? So The A practice, the ones that are staying longer are the ones where they are allowed to do their own treatment planning. They're allowed to, be autonomous. They're on a level with the dentist owner as far as the staff and the patients. They're not questioned. They're not, they're not given the low-level procedures. They're able to expand their procedures. The dentist owner allows them to take additional CE. When they started with the practice, they may have not done ortho or Invisalign, or they may have not done implants, or they may have not done endo, but they had a passion that they wanted to learn more about it, and the dentist said, great, I'll even support you and pay for some of your CE. Certainly a busy private family practice is what I see as the number one where associates have stayed the longest. Where it's a practice that is constantly growing. Most practices, even in ones where there's only two doctors, a doctor and associate, when I look at the collections of the practice, the doctor hired an associate somewhere between $900,000 and $1.2 million. And next thing you know, 5 years later, the practice is doing, $2 million or 2.2. And so I see growth and where they stay. And I see a commitment from the dentist owner who is willing to invest in the growth. I mean, some dentist owners, when they bring on an associate, they start taking more time off. In those instances, I don't see associates stay the longest. And I think I've said about probably 10 things, George, and I could probably go on and name about 20 more things of an A practice, but I don't think we have time enough. But hopefully I've given you the tops for the A there.
Sure thing.
In past episodes, we've mentioned the importance of laying out the flow of your next or first dental practice before moving on to the floor plan. The conceptual layout is key to make sure you get the most from your dental space. But we are not all in the same phase of this process. You may not be looking for a new practice or trying to figure out how to design the most efficient new office possible, and we get that. In reality, many of you may already have a practice and are just trying to figure out how to make that office better today. And part of the beauty of having Design Ergonomics as a sponsor for this podcast is that they have a range. Design Ergonomics emphasizes how they design, equip, and train the best and most productive dental practices in America. It's the final of that 3 steps offering that I want to hear you today. Train. This past year, Design Ergonomics launched their Reboot training, specifically the 2-day dental reboot. The team at Design Ergonomics will send an expert clinical trainer to your practice to physically set up the support systems you need to get your practice headed in the right direction. From how you manage inventory, resupply, and deployment systems to a material assessment and a team training, their experts will do it all over the course of a 2-day hands-on workshop. I have a testimonial here from Dr. John Fornetti.
The very best part of this training was the fact that when they leave, you are set up. So everything is done. So on Monday, you're actually implementing what we learned to do.
And it comes with a guarantee. If you don't see a 20% increase in your practice's productivity in the first 4 months after your training, they will refund your money. This is an incredible opportunity for our listeners because today we are also giving you a special offer. Use the promo code SHAREDTRAINING on the dentalreboot.com Contact Us page and receive a 20% discount on your first reboot training for a limited time. That's right, 20% off your 2-day dental reboot. Again, visit their website, www.dentalreboot.com, and learn more about Design Ergonomics practice productivity solutions today. Again, that is www.dentalreboot.com. I'll leave a link in the show notes.
At one point I wanted to question you on, not that I disagree, I'm just curious.
Okay, yeah.
The seller who takes off more time, why does that not lead to longer associateships?
Well, because what has happened in those instances, the feedback that I've gotten is that the associate feels like the owner only hired them to make money off of them, and that they're not committed, like, because in those instances, they'll say, here's how those have ended, badly. They've said, well, I've grown the practice while you've taken more time off. Can I buy in now? No, you can't buy in now. And, instead, if they took over, I'll give you the most the ones that I see the most are the practice again was doing 700 to 900,000. The associate came on and grew the practice another 500 to 700,000 in 3 to 4 years. And now the associate is doing, say, 800,000 production. The dentist owner at the time was doing, say 700, but they're down to around 500 now, but they're asking the associate to pay for all that growth. So instead of valuing the practice at 650 or 700,000, they're valuing the practice at 1 million or 1.2. And the associate is like, geez, you took off a lot of time. I helped grow the practice. I shouldn't be paying that much. Now, that opens up another topic, which I would like your opinion on. And I try to educate the buyers and the sellers here to be flexible. And, I try to tell from the buyer's standpoint, I like to say, well, the doctor who gave you the opportunity, they deserve some of that growth. You don't get it all for free. And then I try to tell the seller, hey, they grew the practice. Yes, they did it on, you invested, you gave them patience, or you gave them the ability because you started this business, you took all the risk, but you can't charge them for all the growth. So I just like to point that out. But I hope I answered your question of when the dentist takes off and then does not either compensate or give the associate credit, is when I get the call from an associate saying, Wayne, I want to buy a practice. This isn't working out very well. So that's how I know about these situations, by getting the calls from associates who are in those positions who want to move on.
And Wayne, I have a maybe not so kind opinion towards that situation. So
Okay.
I want to share it, and I want to see what you think.
Okay.
I'm open either way, but
Okay.
from the seller's perspective, they could sell the practice to somebody else. Let's just use the example of 1.2 and the associate wants to pay 700 or whatever, and there's a huge difference. I get that it would be nice of the seller and it would be a gracious move, and if I was, the seller, I would probably discount the practice for that individual.
Mm-hmm.
But they could go get market value for the practice if they sold it to somebody else. You know what I mean? So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I guess I have a lot of thoughts on that, but I have two very important ones I'll stick to for this conversation. The first one is I'm just a very ethical business person. So from the standpoint of doing the right thing, is how I like to look at things. So if someone helped you and committed, a couple years to that growth, it's just my opinion. Again, everybody, it's not right or wrong, but my opinion is you should offer them a discount on the practice. And yes, I agree with you 100%. They can sell it at market value to someone else. But my second strong opinion on it is, if that associate leaves, even though there's a non-compete, to sell it to someone else when an associate is leaving is very, I don't see good outcomes with that. I see when I see buyers wanting to buy a practice where there is I'll call it a senior dentist that is 55 plus in age, and there's an associate who's 30 some years of age or 40 something years of age, and they just don't want to own the practice. I get those calls too. Buyers are very leery of buying unless the associate signs a non-compete and wants to stay on and signs a contract for 3 years. So I would say to a seller who says to me, well, Wayne, you know what? If this seller does not want to pay my price, I'm going to find another associate, or I'm going to sell the practice. I would advise them that would be a tough sale. You may not get the full asking price because you have a turbulent situation going on where an associate is leaving or going to leave, or they won't sign. Like a bank will not sign. Of course, I'm not sure if I heard this on your podcast, but I know I've been dealing with a few situations like this where if there is if the non-compete will not be signed by the current in-place associate for the new buyer, the bank will not loan the money. So I just feel like, those are my two big reasons of why I think it's very important. Again, I try to advise a buyer even when they're hiring their first associate, I just say, here's something you're going to have to deal with, and there's no perfect parameter here. There's just ranges, and hopefully you could figure them out, and hopefully your associate is accommodating too. I like talking about that up front, So hope that answers your question, George.
It did, and I think in this situation, I think it's very obvious that we both feel that the seller should discount the price to the associate. But I more want to talk to that associate out there who's frustrated and feels like they should get a discount, but they're not getting it.
Okay.
From that associate's perspective, yes, if you go buy another practice, you're paying market value for that office. If you buy this practice for market value, assuming it is market value, I still think it's more valuable to you than it would be to any other buyer. You're going to have less attrition. You already know, you're already functioning in that office. It's the best office for you to buy. And so I think, ideally the seller would be understanding of, what your contributions have been and give you a portion of that, of the goodwill, and they'll give you a portion of that. But, if that doesn't happen, I would recommend the associates still look at the practice at market value and assess it if it's a good opportunity or not. You know what I mean?
George, yes, I agree, and that would have been the third topic that I would have talked about here. We're on the same page there, absolutely. I have had discussions with associates where I have to say, unfortunately, I know the seller is being unreasonable and not giving you a discount, but you've put in so much time into here. It's where you're from. It's, your family and friends are there. You're only going to grow the practice more. It's going to, I have to say, you're between a rock and a hard place. You're in a tough spot. I wouldn't advise you going out and buying or starting another practice. You've built up too much goodwill at the practice. So yes, you're correct. And unfortunately, I don't like when buyers, that they put associates in that position. But thank goodness those are, infrequent and not the norm. But you're right. If an associate is in that position, I agree with you 100% that before they make a rash decision and are very upset with the seller, they should absolutely take a look at it at market value, because it probably is going to be, in the end, the best thing for them in their career, unfortunately,
Yeah, and I think the last thing I'd say to that is any situation before you ever walk into the practice that there's already some discussions of this type of situation where they'll sell you the practice down the road. In your contract, it would be nice to get something in writing.
Yes, I guess that's the best advice we could give when it pertains to that, is if there could be some upfront discussion, so not to have, be in this situation 4, 5, 6 years down the road would be good.
Yep, I think we're on the same page then.
Okay.
Is there anything else that you wanted to, wrap up and kind of tell our audience words of wisdom?
The thing that I will say is that I think, if I didn't hear this on your podcast, I heard it someplace and I'm like, geez, that's what I've been saying all these years, is that I like to tell, because we have more buyers on this podcast than sellers. So I just like to say to the buyers, I'm a big contingency person. And if they're looking for a practice and looking to buy a practice, I would also tell them, not only give yourself a year or 2 or even 3 years, but during that time frame, plan on maybe opening a practice where you're looking. And, you could do a lot of work that will not go for naught. The time spent looking at, types of plans, offices, real estate. Real estate is crazy. Something may pop up that may be the best, location for a practice because there's a new business development going on, or a new, educational complex going on. I always say yes. It's to me, it's the best thing you could do is to buy an existing practice. That's the best thing you can do. Of course, 9 out of 10 times. But I've seen enough practices that have been very successful, started from scratch because they were doing due diligence, while they were looking to buy a practice. So I'd like to wrap up just by saying, people say, well, Wayne, if I want to buy a practice, why should I waste my time, looking for real estate, doing all this, because even if you buy a practice and some other great real estate pops up or that you'll know about, you may want to move the practice you buy to that real estate. And most of the due diligence that you'll do on, when you start up a practice, you'll probably incorporate 70% of that into your new practice at some point, whether that be equipment or a layout or how you'd like to, how you like to be productive in your practice. So I'm pretty sure either you said that or Richard said that or a guest said that. And I was like, darn, I wanted to say that first on your podcast. So I hope you believe you believe in that too, George. Strongly.
Graham Dursley, he said, pursue both simultaneously.
Okay.
I believe that's who you're talking about.
Great.
Yes.
You have good memory, George.
No, that's advice that he gave me many years ago, and I specifically asked him to say that on the show before we recorded that episode because I really believe in that advice as well, even though I did not follow that advice.
Okay.
I think for a lot of people, they're open to both. But then I think there's a subset of people that personality-wise, maybe one fits better than the other, and they know that, and that's fine.
Sure.
But I think for the majority of people, they want to be practice owners, and whatever route they get there, I think they should have some flexibility and see which one fits them best.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, I appreciate you coming on, Wayne. I know
Thanks,
that
George.
our audience got a lot out of it. I enjoyed the varying topics of the episode. I think that's something we don't do enough on this show, so I think our audience will enjoy that as well.
Well, I enjoyed your comments and commentary and your questions, George. It made for a great podcast. So I think we did a good job today for the audience. I hope they agree.
Thanks, Wayne. And we'll leave your contact information below if anyone wants to reach out to Wayne.
Okay. Thank you, George.
Okay, that was an awesome interview. Before we close out the show, I wanted to thank all of you who have posted some awesome reviews recently. And actually, let me pull these up right here. There's one of them. It's pretty funny. It was Harsh Wiener was his iTunes name. I'm sure that people create these iTunes review names back in the day, and then they go to review something else. And like they were 16 or 17 when they created this iTunes account and created their username on iTunes. And then they go to review something professional and their name is Harsh Wiener. So if you have a funny iTunes name when you created your Apple ID, give us a review. I'll take a snapshot. I've been taking a snapshot of the reviews so that we've got a few more from this week that I'm going to post. We really appreciate the reviews, and we're about to hit 200. We're at 198 as of today. So please, please, please help us to hit that 200 mark. Quick review on iTunes. Thank you guys so much. Hope you enjoyed this show, and we'll talk to you next week on the Shared Practices Podcast.